take on that ride.
Yeah, it must be nice because, you know, I like nature, but from a safe distance. I like a window and you look at nature. I don't like to be.
It has to be something in between, basically.
In between, yeah. And I read that the Russian one, Trans-Siberian Express, which one line also goes to Beijing, that it's not so well, a little bit dirty, that which was done, I think, in cooperation with some Dutch, Netherlands, whatever, that yours is better, it's nicer, yours, from Beijing to Lhasa. It's around 4 days, 3.5, 4 days, no?
It's right now, it's the modern one, so it's the high-speed one you can take.
Yeah, and I also read that now, how do they work? They already replacing planes? I heard that you have now an ultra express train connection between Beijing and Shanghai.
Yeah, I think most of people would prefer to take trains because it will help.
We know why, because plane, even if it's shorter, but you have to be there, check in, blah, blah, and so on. While if you have a good seat on the train, you plug in electricity, you can work in peace. It's not lost time, no?
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, exactly. Okay, I think right now that we have a good size of people, I think most of people have come in already. So if you don't mind,
if they are late, it's good psychological advantage because if we already begin, the late people will feel guilty a little bit. Oh, we missed it. And so we win. They will not be too annoying then, you know.
Wow. Okay, yeah. Let's do that then. Yeah. Okay. So welcome everyone and welcome to this seminar. There are a lot of people here today, and I believe that all of us really look forward to this talk. So I will do firstly a little bit self-introduction for those people who don't know me. So my name is Xiaoyu. So I'm currently teaching at School of International Studies at Peking University. And today, the format of our event will be that we will have our speaker to talk about the subject for about 60 minutes, 70 minutes, depending on how Professor Zizek wants to elaborate. And then that will open to the Q&A. So we want to give as much time and as much room that we can for the audience to engage with this subject. So if you have any question during and after the talk, please do feel free to either raise your hand or write to me about your questions, or there's a Q&A session in the Zoom webinar where you can leave questions. So do feel free to do so and anytime. And by the end of the talk, I will collect all the questions and read them out basically one by one to Professor Zizek. Okay, now come to our character for today, our guest speaker, Professor Zizek, which I don't think will need actual detailed introduction, who is a philosopher, who is a public intellectual, who write, publish, and comment restlessly about our contemporary society and politics. And I think that whether you agree with his argument or with his point of views, I think it is undoubted that he's probably the most engaging character now that captured the very spirit of philosophy, contemporary philosophy nowadays. And I admire him for his continuous engagement in public affairs and issues. And today, like the subject we would like to have Professor Zizek here to talk about is disorder, which I believe right now has become the common and shared feelings for many individuals and for many societies around the world. And I want to use two quotations, which I think Professor Zizek, one of them that you probably have not heard of before. So the first quotation is from the Italian writer and also philosopher, Umberto Eco. So when Eco came to China in 1990 to attend an international conference on comparative literature, he was giving the concluding speech. And this is even before the end of the Cold War. But he said that something I don't like. He said that we all got it wrong. So nowadays, what actually happened is that this is the era of the Great Migration. And it is triggering some of the issues that the human society never encountered before. And he ended his speech exactly like this. He said that right now that there is a great chaos or disorder under the heavens, my friends. And this is the news I bring to you from Europe. And I think that this quotation has been used again and again nowadays, actually, among my friends, among our circle, when we try to kind of capture what is happening actually around us. And I think back in the 1990s, we still think that disorder was something that moving from one place to the other, like spreading like a disease. But I think nowadays it seems to be that there are news from everywhere. There are disorders equaling and resonating with each other. So this very sense of crisis and very sense of disorder has become a normalized, if not a permanent condition. To name a few, the COVID pandemic, populism, protest, environmental crisis, and including right now, probably the worst sandstorm that we're going through in Beijing in recent years. So I think that's in a way draws us to the second question, is that if disorder has become a general condition, how do we respond to it, or how do we get out of it? And here is a quotation I believe Mr. Zizek used a lot, and this is also, I think, inspiration to your book, which you published 2 years ago. It's from the Chinese previous leader Mao Zedong, who said that there is great disorder under the heavens, and the situation is excellent. I think what he's trying to say, of course, is that behind those kind of feelings of disorientation, disorder, we can find opportunities. We can find new forms of solidarity and politics of hope that open the room for new revolutionary movement. But that comes with a danger, because when there's a hope and expectation, there's also desperation and frustration. I think Jacqueline Rose once specifically pointed out, saying that in responding to catastrophe, to crisis, we do seem to have this kind of, we're easily being tempted to tyranny. And I think right now that the tyranny is not only in form of political personal leaders, but it can also be non-human actors. Nowadays, people talking about AI, talking about ChatGPT, like Adventists, basically. This arrival of this kind of new, strong, powerful leader will be saving human beings or society out of the crisis or out of the current disorder. So I think right now it's more important than ever that we stop and reflect, like what Professor Zizek, I think, has been trying to advocate for the past few years, and to really think what are the things we can actually draw from the current disorder? What are the futures that do we want? And I think most importantly is that what are the effective and real political actions and instruments we can mobilize and use in responding to the current disorder? And ending on that note, I will right now give the floor to Professor Zizek. And we really look forward to your presentation and to your ideas on this subject. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And I cannot adequately put it in words how honored I am by this invitation, because, we, as I will say, I think in the text, we in the West, we are often critical of China. And I think this is not a priori bad, because sometimes looking at a country from outside, you can see clearly its tensions and so on. But at the same time, we, from the so-called West, tend to project our narrow categories onto China. Now, even if I'm up to a point critical of what's going on in China, I noticed from reading a lot of stuff about China that this typical Western measuring of China, it's either China is already capitalist, approaching capitalism, or your new, a couple of years, leader, Xi, is reintroducing hardline communism, whatever. I think it's much more complex. It's not this simple opposition. So nonetheless, I must begin by an apology, and please criticize me in the Q&A if you will find traces of my narrow European standpoint, where I may misperceive things. So let me begin. One of Mao Zedong's best-known sayings is the one already mentioned in the introduction: there is great disorder under the heavens, so the situation is excellent. Mao speaks here about disorder under heaven, or what in my jargon I call the big other, in whatever form. The logic of historical process, the laws of social development still exist and discreetly regulate social chaos. Today, however, I think we should talk about heaven itself being in disorder. What do I mean by this? Let me mention you a tasteless example, but it was a shock for me even of in what crazy times we live. A year or so ago, I was reading a text about how the Nazis tortured prisoners in the concentration camps during World War II. And it affected me quite traumatically when I found that they used industrially made testicle crushers. You know, like you have those small machines to crush the nuts or whatever. They made them industrially, distributed them into concentration camps to, it must be an unbearable pain, to crush the testicles of the prisoners. Then I wanted to check it up. Is this a myth or reality? So I went to Google and put search for testicle crushers or ball crushers. And I was shocked what I found. Nothing about Nazi concentration camps, but I found dozens of sites which offer you the similar things today, not to torture enemies, but for sadomasochist enjoyment. They cost over $200. They're exquisitely made. You put your testicles into two like empty balls, then you can regulate the pressure. You have additional needles to penetrate your testicles. One advertisement says, pick your poison for pleasure from this ball torture group. Stainless steel ball crusher, stainless ball clamp torture device, brutal cock wise torture toy, hardcore stainless ball torture, and so on. So what made me to think is this passage from the ball crusher used to torture prisoners in Nazi concentration camps to the ball crusher. This is nicely made, looks like out of silver. You can buy it for, usually they cost a little bit over $200 to play sadomasochistic, erotic games. The question that bothers us today is why does, because today allegedly we live, at least we think we live in the West, in a permissive era. Anything that is done consensually is permitted in sex. But why does the permissive stance towards sexual pleasure entail impotence and frigidity? It is as if pleasure is not enough. Since pleasure is permitted, you have to supplement it with torturing. Why? The only way for many people to enjoy sexual pleasure is through pain. We obviously live in a very strange time. Now comes the most difficult part. I want to give you some general philosophical even vision. In the contemporary apocalyptic situation, the ultimate horizon of our future is what French theorist of catastrophe who lives in Stanford calls the dystopian fixed point. We have now even many of these points because we have multiple catastrophes. Some people fear now nuclear war, the end. Some people fear ecological breakdown, global warming, and so on. Other people fear global economic and social chaos, and so on. And I don't know how it is in China, but in the West, this is almost the most popular science fiction genre. Imagine how things will be after some kind of global catastrophe. Now, this is a very ambiguous phenomenon. My good friend, also known in China, Frederick Jameson, the Marxist, discovered in this post-apocalyptic catastrophes signs of utopia, because the idea is that even if the whole world as we know it disappears, there will be a new society which will be less alienated, with more solidarity, and so on. I don't know if it was shown in China, but maybe you get it illegally, that new American post-apocalyptic series, The Last of Us, where United States are destroyed by new kind of zombies, and then there is terror everywhere. And there is only one small city which organized itself in a way of cooperation, solidarity, and you know what happens? My favorite line of a dialogue, when two heroes of the series come to that city and are claimed, but wait a minute, you live in communism here. And somebody says, the leader of this city, yes, sorry, we are communists. So always be attentive for the secret utopia. But let me go on. So even if the final catastrophe is indefinitely postponed, this 0 point is what they once called in chaos theory an attractor, a virtual point towards which our reality tends. The way to combat the future catastrophe is through acts which interrupt our drifting towards this fixed point. This is very sad because mostly, at least in the developed world, we no longer dream about new society, whatever. Our fixed point is catastrophe. Artificial intelligence takes over, ecological catastrophe, whatever, and how to stop this. Now, Dupuy, D-U-P-U-Y, excellent theorist. Dupuy's point is that if we are to confront properly the threat of a catastrophe, we have to introduce a new notion of time. Dupuy calls it the time of a project, of a closed circuit between the past and the future. The future, of course, is causally produced by our acts in the past. But the way we act now is determined by our anticipation of the future and our reaction to this anticipation. So Dupuy's solution or formula is, we should first perceive the catastrophe as our fate, as unavoidable. And then projecting ourselves into this catastrophic future, adopting its standpoint, we should retroactively insert into the past of the future, counterfactual possibilities upon which we can act today. The logic of, if we were to do that and that, the catastrophe we are in now would not have occurred. To put it in another way, the past is open to retroactive interpretations. We cannot, of course, change the past literally, but we can read it in a totally different way. To change our future, we should first change, in the sense of reinterpretation, our past. What do I mean by this? For example, now everybody is afraid, will there be a new world war? The answer can only be a paradoxical one. If there will be a new war, it will be a necessary one. Or a quote from Dupuy, if an outstanding event takes place, a catastrophe, for example, it could not have taken place. Nonetheless, insofar as it didn't take place, it is not inevitable. I hope you got the paradox here. When something becomes actual, becomes reality, it retroactively creates its necessity. What do I mean by this? Let me go directly into today's situation. If, we all hope not, the full military conflict will explode between United States and Iran, between mainland China and Taiwan, between Russia and NATO, it will appear necessary. We will automatically read the past that led to this catastrophe as a series of causes which necessarily led to the explosion. If it will not happen, we will read it the way we today read the Cold War, as a series of dangerous moments where the catastrophe was avoided because both sides were aware of the deadly consequences of the global conflict. Now, there is a story which beautifully illustrates this point. I don't know how well it is known in China. I suspect it's more a Western fantasy about Zhou Enlai, you know, the Chinese prime minister in the 50s and 60s. When in 1953, Zhou Enlai was in Geneva for the peace negotiations to end the Korean War, a French journalist asked him what does he think about the French Revolution. Zhou Enlai replied, it is still too early to tell. And we can say now, in some sense, he was right. Because with the disintegration of East European communist states, so-called people's democracies, in the late 1990s, the struggle for the historical place of the French Revolution exploded again. For the right-wingers and liberals, 1989, the disintegration of Soviet Union and so on, meant that the whole era, which began with French Revolution, because it was exactly 200 years, came to an end. That revolutionary model is lost. But now that we again have emancipatory movements, unrest, and so on, the idea is maybe we should return to French Revolution as a unique moment of emancipatory movement, which is actual even today. Back to Zhu Enlai. I read that what most probably happened is this, not in 1953, but in 1972, when Henry Kissinger visited China. He asked Zhu Enlai what he thinks about the '68 rebellion in France. And it is to this question that Zhu Enlai replied, "It is too early to tell." And again, he was right. 1968 was a leftist anti-establishment rebellion, but its slogans against alienated university education, for sexual freedom and so on, were soon appropriated by the establishment and enabled the smooth passage to new neoliberal, hedonist, permissive capitalism. So, you know what I'm saying? I'm arguing that history is open. It is not necessary in advance. It, as it were, creates its own necessity. For example, as far as I understand things in China, when Mao intervened in mid-1920s with this turn from big cities, proletariat, to farmers, peasants, and this idea of ordinary people, farmers, should encircle the cities. Now we saw this work, but I think it may have happened otherwise, that this peasant rebellion would have been crushed, and then we would have said, oh, Mao was just a distraction, it didn't really work. No, it's good that it happened. What I'm only saying is that I'm more open relativist than the old determinist Marxism, which sees a certain necessity. I think this necessity is always, up to a point, retroactively created. When a thing happens, it appears that it had to happen, but it's always backwards. And it's not just that we read the past in such a way that we project our later perspective onto it. I think that the past is in itself open. So what we have is not just two possibilities today, either a military, ecological, social catastrophe or recovery. What we have are, and I'm using here the term superposition more in the sense of quantum mechanics, superposition of different states, two superposed necessity. In our predicament, it is necessary in the sense that it's part of where the system is spontaneously moving, that there will be a global catastrophe. But at the same time, it is necessary that we act to prevent it. That's the paradox. So which are these two at the most general level, superposed necessities today? In an interview on a state Russian TV, now, 2 weeks ago, on April the 6th, Victor Baut, an international arms dealer, told a reporter that he had sent a telegram to Donald Trump urging him to flee Russia, to emigrate from United States to Russia for safety. That's this guy's Victor Bout's predicament, a quote. Most likely he, Trump, will be simply eliminated there in the United States. Therefore, I think it's in the best interest of all of humanity and primarily of the American people to invite Trump here to Russia, to give him security and protection here so that he leads the uprising against the globalists, and more important, so that he does not allow the elimination of the American people, end of quote. Absurd as it may sound, this proposal of a direct alliance between today's Russia and the Trumpian populism, they are allies in their shared uprising against the neoliberal capitalist globalism, it renders perfectly the ideological project of Russia, the idea of a new multipolar world in which even the people of the states which dominate in today's global order will be liberated. Recall Trump's motto, America first. So multipolar world will be a world in which each country will put forward, will act upon its full sovereignty and its interests. That's why, according to this guy Bout, Trump's move to Russia is, I quote, in the best interests of all of humanity and primarily all of the American people. It's the only way to prevent the elimination of the American people by the ruling globalists. So when Vladimir Putin says America has nothing to offer the world except domination, he is attacking America as a global power, which at the same time exploits the majority of the American people. America following America First policy, this is Trump's motto, would fit perfectly Putin's vision when, during his annual speech to the discussion club on October 27th, 22, he criticized the United States and its allies in the West and called on the other country in the non-aligned world to join Russia in building a new multipolar world. Quote from Putin: real democracy in a multipolar world, first of all, presupposes the possibility for any nation, any society, and any civilization to choose their own way, their own socio-political system. If the United States and the European Union countries have this right, then the Asian countries, the Islamic states, the monarchies of the Persian Gulf, the states of other continents certainly have this right as well, end of quote. Now, in an abstract sense, these claims may sound convincing. The 0 degree of democracy is the right of each country to choose freely its own socio-political system. Sounds nice, but I have a problem here. What about the ongoing protests in Iran? We have to accept the fact that a reference to Western democracy and human rights can also serve as an indication of authentic protest. Protests may use this reference to Western values, although their activity is in no way Eurocentric. So to put the cause of unrests and protests, to put the cause on Western propaganda can also be deceiving. The true problem is, why are people who protest resorting to Western notion of human rights, freedoms, and so on? Why are they not able to formulate their dissatisfaction in our own language? Let me go a step further. When Putin claims that also the Islamic State and the monarchies of the Persian Gulf have the right to choose their way of life, I think he ignores the inner antagonisms, the inner struggles in these countries. As the case of protest in Iran demonstrates, these inner antagonisms open up the space for another universalism opposed to the imperialist universalism, the universalism of the struggle for emancipation. A 22-year-old woman of Kurdish origins who died while in police custody, beaten to death by the Islamic morality police. And she was arrested after being accused of wearing an improper hijab cover. These protests in Iran combine different struggles against women's oppression, against religious oppression, for political freedom, against state terror, and so on, into an organic unity. Iran is not part of the developed West. So, Zendegi Azadi, which means woman, life, freedom, the slogan of the protest, is very different from Me Too and other feminist movements in the West. It mobilizes millions of ordinary women, and it is directly linked to struggle of all, men included. Women and men are together in it. The enemy is a religious fundamentalism supported by state terror. The oppression of women is not a special case. It is the moment in which the oppression that permits the entire society is most visible. Plus, the protesters see it clearly that religious fundamentalism can only remain in power if it is supported by the brutal state power terror. Iranian protests thus realize what the Western leftists can only dream about. They avoid the traps of Western middle-class feminism. They directly link the struggle for women's freedom with the struggle of women and men against ethnic oppression, against state terror, and so on. What goes on now in Iran is something that awaits us in the developed Western world, where political violence, religious fundamentalism, and oppression of women are now growing daily. So we in the West has no right to treat Iran as a country which has just to catch up with the West. We in the West have to learn from Iran. We need similar movements in the West. So it is not just enough to express sympathy or solidarity with Iranian protesters. They are not out there far from us, part of a different exotic culture. All the babble about cultural specificities became meaningless. We can immediately see that the Iranian struggle is the struggle of us all. There is a story which I like about a group of wealthy Western philanthropists visiting a poor third world tribe. But the chief of this tribe tells them, if you are here to offer us your sympathy and compassion, you better return home. If you are here to join our struggle, you are welcome. But why is it so difficult to arrive at this point of global solidarity? What makes me really depressed today is that we live in an era of unholy alliances, a combination of ideological elements which violate the standard opposition of left and right. Let me just mention one of the saddest recent examples. At the end of February this year, 2 months ago, the parliament of Uganda, the African country, debated a further toughening of the anti-homosexual laws. The most radical proponents demanded death penalty, or at least life imprisonment for those caught in a homosexual act. Anita Among, Speaker of the Parliament, said in the debate, "You are either with us or you are with the West." Feminist gay and trans struggles are thereby denounced as an instrument of Western ideological colonization used to undermine African identity. What we find in such cases is that when a society is not ready to confront its immanent antagonism, it projects the cause of its problems into an external agent. An authentic emancipatory thought is not a vision of conflict-free, harmonious future, but the properly dialectical notion of antagonism, which is totally incompatible with the right-wing topic of the need for an enemy to assert our self-identity. Here is Martin Heidegger's articulation of the need for an enemy. I think this is a horrible quote from Heidegger's course of 1933-34 when he was close to Marxism. Please be patient, it's a longer quote. An enemy is each and every person who poses an essential threat to the Dasein, existence, of the people and its individual members. The enemy does not have to be external, and the external enemy is not even always the most dangerous one. It can seem as if there are no enemies. Then it is a fundamental requirement to find the enemy, to expose the enemy to the light, or even first to make the enemy, so that this standing against the enemy may happen, and so that Dasein, human existence, may not lose its edge. The challenge is to bring the enemy into the open, to harbor no illusions about the enemy, to keep oneself ready for attack, to cultivate and intensify a constant readiness, and to prepare the attack, looking far ahead towards the goal of total annihilation of the enemy. End of quote. The most ominous passage is here, I think, when Heidegger writes that we have to expose the enemy to the light, or even first to make the enemy. In short, it doesn't even matter if the enemy is a real enemy. If there is no enemy, it has to be invented so that the people can be mobilized and prepare for the enemy's total annihilation. What we find here is the logic of anti-Semitism at its most elementary. What Heidegger ignores is the possibility that an enemy is invented to create the false unity of the people and thus to cover up its immanent antagonism. The true danger of this Heidegger stance is that he presents the invasion and elimination of the enemy as the proper ethical stance. What do I mean by this? Let me give you an extreme, disgusting example of this stance. Heinrich Himmler, the leader of SS in Nazi Germany, gave a famous speech in Poznan, today Poznan, a Polish city, and he spoke there quite openly about the mass killing of the Jews as a glorious page in our German history, and one that has never been written and never can be written. He then goes on to characterize the ability to do this and to remain decent as the greatest virtue. Quote, terrifying from Himmler. To have gone through the extermination of the Jews and at the same time to have remained decent, that has made us hard. One principle must be absolute for the SS man. We must be honest, decent, loyal, and friendly to members of our blood and to no one else. Whether the other races live in comfort or perish of hunger interests me only insofar as we need them as slaves for our culture. Whether or not 10,000 Russian women collapse from exhaustion while digging a tank ditch interests me only insofar as the tank ditch is completed for Germany, and so on. And I don't have time to go into it, but you find even more nightmarish phrases in Himmler. Like Himmler says, what if German soldiers encountered a scared Jewish woman with a child? They are both desperate and crying. And of course, naturally, you find sympathy for them. But he says, if you feel any sympathy for them, you're a traitor to German nation. Let me go on. What is so terrifying for me here is that although what Himmler is talking about is evil, it's nonetheless, in some sense, an ethical evil. It's not simply pragmatic opportunism. It's evil, but evil that you pursue as an ethical duty to the end, even risking your life for it. We find a similar stance, although not in such extreme form, all around the world today. In March 2022, Donald Trump called for the termination of the Constitution to overturn the 2020 election and to reinstate him to power. A quote, literally, from Donald Trump. Do you throw the presidential election results of 2020 out and declare the rightful winner, or do you have a new election? A massive fraud of this type and magnitude allows for the termination of all rules, regulations, and articles, even those found in the Constitution. End of quote. It looks that in some Western democracies, the legal system cannot even maintain the appearance of freedom democracy. If it wants to survive, it has to break openly its own laws. True courage is thus redefined as the courage to break the laws if state interests demand it. We find this stance in the properly rightist admiration for celebrating the heroes who are ready to do the necessary dirty job. The formula is, it is easy to do a noble thing for your country, even sacrificing your life for it. But it is much more difficult to commit a crime for your country. Be very careful about this ethic, which defines courage precisely as the courage to do evil, horrible things when your country demands it. Such weird ethics is grounded in today's geopolitical situation, defined by a good American philosopher, my friend Adrian Johnston, as, again, a quote, a situation in which the world's societies and humanity as a whole are facing multiple acute crises: global pandemic, environmental disasters, massive inequality, ballooning poverty, potentially devastating wars, and so on. Yet, our societies seem unable to take the admittedly radical measures necessary to resolve this crisis. We know things are broken. We know what needs to be, we know what needs fixing. We even sometimes have ideas about how to fix things. But nevertheless, we keep doing nothing, either to mend damage already done or to prevent further easily foreseeable damage. End of quote. Where does this strange passivity come from? Today's capitalism generates apathy precisely because it demands from us permanent hyperactivity, constant engagement in its devastating dynamic. So to open up the path for a real change, we have first to put a brake on the mad rhythm of continuous change. Apathy is just the other side of extreme dynamism. Things change all the time to make it sure that nothing that matters will really change. It's a little bit like what in psychoanalytic terms I call the compulsive neurotic behavior. And I know what this means because I am one of those, I think. When I'm in an embarrassing situation, I get hyperactive. I talk all the time, not to achieve something, but to make it sure that the others don't have time to raise the truly important question. You know, like I talk all the time to make it sure that nothing will really change. This hyperactivity also allows us to explain how today's capitalism succeeds to neutralize threats and critical voices to a degree unthinkable for Marx. In the classic Enlightenment way, when an individual caught in ideology understands the hidden mechanism of ideological deception, the symptom disappears. The spell of ideology is broken. But today, when ideology functions in a cynical mode, it includes a distance towards itself, or, to repeat Peter Sloterdijk's old formula of cynicalism, today ideology no longer functions as Marx described it. They don't know they're doing, but they're still doing it. No, today is, I know what I'm doing, but I'm nonetheless doing it. This is how in today's capitalism, ideology includes and thereby neutralizes critical knowledge. Critical distance towards the social order is the very medium through which this order reproduces itself. Let me give you a marginal but my favorite example. I hope China is not yet caught into this. The big art biennales, Venice, Kassel, and so on. If you look at their program, it's extremely critical. They present themselves as fighting global capitalism, its commodification of everything, and so on and so on. But precisely through this radical critical attitude, these biennales function perfectly as a moment of capitalist reproduction. Now let me go back to my main line. So, in contrast to the struggle against the enemy, which aims at preserving one's identity, this is always the focus of right-wing conspiracy theory. There is an enemy. For some in the West, China, or I don't know who, communists, or name them. And we must, as Heidegger put it, annihilate the enemy to preserve our identity, threatened by the other. The threat comes from outside. But I think a true emancipatory movement knows that the first task is not to defeat the enemy, but to change ourselves so that we will be in a position to win over the enemy. And here is the problem of most of today's leftist critical thought. Let me give you my favorite example. Back in 1937, George Orwell, the author of 1984, deployed the ambiguity of the predominant leftist attitude towards class difference. A quote, beautiful one, from Orwell. We all rail against class distinctions, but very few people seriously want to abolish them. Here you come upon the important fact that many revolutionary opinions draw part of their strength from a secret conviction that nothing can be changed. So long as it is merely a question of ameliorating the workers' lot, every decent person agrees. But unfortunately, you get no further by only wishing class distinctions away. It is necessary to wish them away, but your wish has no efficacy unless you grasp what it involves. The fact that has to be faced is that to abolish class distinctions means abolishing a part of yourself. I have got to alter myself so completely that at the end, I should hardly be recognizable as the same person. So again, this is where I think these big persons of charity like Bill Gates, this is their fake. They sincerely help the poor, but they don't accept that their position of almost new feudal lords, oligarchs, mega rich, is the cause of the poverty and exclusion of those they are trying to help. Such radical self-change is needed because of the antagonisms exploding today. We are in the middle of a global crisis. Even the Financial Times, the big daily journal of financial capital, declared in a recent editorial that neoliberalism has to descend from the global scene since its time has passed. Capitalist dynamic more and more looks like a hamster running in the circle of its cage. So what is needed? The first thing to do is to learn to cross the red lines imposed by neoliberal ideology. Today's capitalism can survive much more radical interventions than it may appear. An Italian economist, Mariana Mazzucato, pointed out that the same system which constantly repeated the mantra that we cannot raise the taxes to fight global warming was able to spend trillions to combat the Omicron epidemic. So the first thing to do is we should begin to courageously strengthen what Peter Sloterdijk again called objective social democracy. The true triumph of social democracy took place when its basic demands, free education and healthcare and so on, became part of the program accepted by all main parties. When these social democratic measures are inscribed into the functioning of the state institutions themselves. But now comes my pessimism. This will not be enough. When confronted with new global crises, we will have to act fast, decisively, and globally. Simon Jenkins, a British commentator, wrote apropos the National Health Service crisis in the UK, that this crisis is to be taken very seriously. Here is a brief quote. The national health crisis is historic. A war footing is the only way to deal with it. So we are left today with today's emergency. Nothing diminishes the support and affection for frontline staff. Like soldiers in wartime, they are workers to whom people instinctively turn when all seems lost. End of quote. And the situation is similar all across Europe, from Germany to my own Slovenia. Like even at an emergency now in Slovenia, emergency, you have to wait around 20 hours. So to cope with the ongoing crisis, we will need elements of what I'm tempted to call provocatively war communism. Mobilizations that will have to violate the usual market and political rules. The existing multi-party parliamentary system is not effective enough to cope with the crisis which beset us. However, don't be afraid, I am approaching the end. However, things get here again complicated. The most brutal and depressive fact of recent history is that the only recent case of violent revolutionary crowd invading the seat of power happened on January 6, 2021 in Washington, when a crowd of Trump supporters broke into the Capitol in an attempt to deny the results of democratic elections. No wonder there was a mix of fascination and horror present in the left liberal reaction to this protest. Ordinary people breaking into the sacred seat of power. A carnival that momentarily suspended our rules of public life. Does this mean that the populist right stole from the left the last resort of their resistance to the existing system, the popular attack on the seat of power? Is the only choice in the West the one between parliamentary elections, of course, controlled by corporate elites, and uprising controlled by the populist right? But the answer to this should be, I think, the following one. Global capitalism already changed so radically that some, like my friend Yanis Varoufakis, even no longer call the new emerging order capitalism, but corporate neo-feudalism. The pandemic gave a boost to this new corporate order, with new feudal lords like Bill Gates or Mark Zuckerberg more and more controlling our common spaces of communication and exchange. And one should complicate even further the picture here. It is not just that the privatized commons are the space within which exchange and communication takes place. The ideal counterpart of neo-feudal privatized commons are precarious workers who experience themselves as free entrepreneurs, since they, as a rule, own their own means of production. A computer, of a programmer, a car, for an Uber driver. Precarious work has. What this means is that, now I'm coming to conclusions, that neoliberal capitalism is already dying. So the forthcoming battle will not be the one between neoliberalism and its beyond, but the one between two forms of this beyond, corporate neo-feudalism and a rude awakening which will compel us to invent new forms of solidarity. So now, really, just to conclude, I would like to, I don't know if it is known in China, to introduce a concept elaborated by Nassim Taleb, the concept of anti-fragility. Some systems are strengthened by encounters with disorder, since they react to the disorder with a non-linear response. Anti-fragility is thus different from simple robustness or resilience. It causes an entity to improve with, not to withstand stressors, stressful elements, if, of course, these elements come in the right dose. The classic example from the 20th century would be the different fate of the Communist Party rule in Soviet Union and in China. When Gorbachev started his process of glasnost and perestroika, he obviously underestimated the fragility of the Soviet system. He thought that the system would not only be able to survive these measures, but that these measures, glasnost, perestroika, will even strengthen the system. But when the changes were imposed, they unleashed an avalanche which changed the world. With Deng Xiaoping's reforms, the Chinese proceeded in a radically different, almost opposite way. While at the level of the economy and up to a point culture, what is usually understood as communism was, or it appeared to be, abandoned, the gates were open to what we thought is Western-style liberalization, profit-making, hedonist individualism, and so on. The party nonetheless maintained its ideological political hegemony as the ultimate guarantee of China's stability and prosperity. The Chinese party thus displays a far stronger anti-fragility. The changes effectively strengthened the symptom. Now, truly the finish, a further distinction is to be introduced here between a system anti-fragile enough to survive a strong external shock while remaining the same, and the system which survived such an external shock, but with its nature radically changed. With regard to China, some historians think that China, after Deng's reforms, is no longer a communist country, but something new for which we do not have a proper definition. And the same holds for global capitalism. It is changing into something new, which can be characterized as capitalism only if we redefine capitalism in a new way. And the rise of artificial intelligence confronts all of us with a similar test. Will humans show enough anti-fragility to survive and emerge even stronger from integrating the artificial intelligence into their daily lives, or will they be extinct as humans? If humanity survives, will it remain the same humanity, the same substantial content of being human, just enriched by a new dimension of experience, or will the very core of being human be transformed? So let's not think just about the threat of artificial intelligence will still be human. Let's think how, if artificial intelligence will penetrate even our daily lives, in what sense we will have to redefine what a human being is. This is a difficult philosophical question, so here thinking is needed. Thank you very much for your patience.
Thank you very much, Professor Zizek. I'm sorry that although we have a lot of audience online, you don't have that. I'm sorry that although we have a lot of audience online, you cannot see all of them, and I believe that by the end of speech,
maybe it's better, because otherwise I would be horrified. You know, if you see them all, then I am a pessimist, and I would focus on the one who is yawning, who is falling asleep. It's nice not to see them. Sorry.
Right. And now we move to the question part.
Yes.
So that for our online participants, if you have any question, you can also raise your hand. I will promote you to the panelist, and you can raise your question in person, or you can write in the Q&A session, which I'm going to read out the question later as well. Okay. I saw that Chen Yixi right now raised that his or her hand. So I'm going to Yixi, can you hear me? I promote you right now to the panelist, and you can unmute yourself and ask your question.
Yeah, she has to unmute first, or he should unmute.
No, yeah, I'm not quite sure about the gender actually. Okay, there's no response. So the next one is Wenxuan.
My God, the same problem. They don't unmute themselves.
Yes.
I see neither.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, thanks, Mr. Zizek. I have a question. What do you think is the efficient method to influence the public in a rational rather than a joyful or something like a libido way? Thanks.
Sorry, I didn't quite get the question. What is the efficient way to address people? What was the first part? Not in libidinal sense, but in rational.
Yeah, I'm asking the question about how to influence the public in a rational way. Yeah.
In the
regional or rational? Sorry, how did you understand it? Regional or rational?
I think that he meant regional, but I'm not quite sure.
I think he meant rational.
Yeah. That's it.
Rational. Okay, rational.
rational. Okay. First, there is. I will give you just it's a nice question, but again, a difficult one. I will give you a very simple, but I think correct, although I'm very critical of Marxism, also correct Marxist answer. If by libidinal, we don't mean it in these simple terms, sadism, sexuality, but as a general stance of emotional, personal engagement, then I think, as many Marxists points out, that there are different types of rationality, and that what we usually mean by rationality, this cold, distanced observation, is also a fake. It's part of the system. Today's economists, politicians, they like to assume this role of neutral observers, We don't take sides. We just think describe what is happening, what can be done, and so on and so on. So this, for me, is not really the correct way to grasp the truth. I accept here a Marxist stance and the stance of all emancipatory movements that personal engagement, a view which is not neutral but interested, engaged, and truth, universal truth, do not exclude each other. You find this in a naive way. We cannot simply apply it today. How? For Marx, Marxism is not simply you look objectively at history and you see it points towards communism, whatever we think. Today, it's difficult to claim that. No, to see society in a proper way for a Marxist means to see it from the standpoint of the exploited, of the oppressed. So in this, again, we go on into what we mean by libidinal. Also capitalism. You remember when I mentioned ethical evil, apropos the Nazis and so on. Usually capitalism is dismissed by some critics as an egotist, short-sighted stance. You don't care about ruining our environment. You think only about profit and so on and so on. But as already, maybe you know him, Walter Benjamin, the great marginal member of Frankfurt School, pointed out, capitalism has its own ethics, even religion. A true capitalist is not an egotist who wants to enjoy. A true capitalist is the one who is ready to work to death almost, just so that capitalist circulation goes on. So one way to fight capitalism is, for me, also from the standpoint of simple egotism, maybe not personal egotism, but at least interest of your family and so on. Like, okay, capitalist progress, brutto product is growing, but what will this mean for the future of me, my children, my friends, and so on and so on? So again, if by rational you mean, it depends what you mean. I don't believe in neutral rationality. For me, rationality in the good, more dialectical sense means that it's not only simply true what you are saying, true at the level of facts. Yes, that is extremely important. But that you also reflect on what subjective, not in the sense of individuality, but subjective in the sense of collective subjectivities, what you consider rational works, functions, and so on. There is no neutral rationality, I think. I'll give you my favorite example. Maybe you know it. Let's take brutal example that we are in 1935 or 6 in Germany, and I am against Nazi anti-Semitism. And I engaged in a debate with another person who is pro-Nazi, he is against the Jews. What's the problem with anti-Semitism? It's not enough to say that anti-Semitism is irrational, wrong at the level of facts. Because at the level of facts, it's ambiguous, like, to be very brutal, and I'm totally against anti-Semitism. Some of the facts that Nazis put forward apropos Jews were factually true. A large part of financial elite of bankers in Germany were Jews. A majority of avant-garde artists and art critics, especially in Germans, were Jewish. So the result will be, yeah, okay, the truth is somewhere in the middle. No, the truth, when you encounter an anti-Semitic person or racist in general, the true question is not, is what they are saying true in the sense of fitting the facts? The true question is, why are they saying this? Why does a Nazi need anti-Semitism to sustain its vision of the world? And the reason I think here it's clear. The basis of fascism is that you believe that society is in itself a global, harmonic, hierarchic order. So if you get class struggle tensions, it means you should put the blame on an external intruder. If you erase this external intruder, Jews or today more fashionable immigrants, you have to confront the inner antagonisms, tensions of your own society. You see, this is for me what is false in anti-Semitism. It's not a question, are Jews really like that? It's a question of why do you need the figure of the Jew? And I would apply the same, for example, at a different level. It's not quite the same for the Stalinist purges, you know, in 35, 36, in Soviet Union, millions were liquidated. Now everybody admits that most of these accusations were invented and so on and so on. So the question we should raise is why at that point did the Stalinist system need this paranoid stance of searching everywhere for the enemies and so on and so on? This is for me the true rationality. As for libidinal, I still think here I am a Freudian. I still think that maybe Marxism is a little bit too optimistic in the sense that Marxists tend to project all, let's say, in intimate lives, sexual oppression, oppression of women, and so on. They tend to reduce these to external economic, social causes. Like when you have a feminism, the old communists usually said, be patient, let's do socialist revolution, and then automatically the lot of women, fate of women will be improved. No, I think that phenomena, to put it very brutally and abstractly, I don't think human nature is in itself good. It's a contradictory mess full of irrationalities and so on. I'm not an irrationalist. I just claim that we have to rationally analyze these irrationalities. This is for me the crucial point, not to dismiss irrationalities. Some people claim both sides. For today, for conservatives, the only normal thing is heterosexuality, standard heterosexuality. If you do different things in sex, you are too promiscuous, you engage in new forms of sex, this is pathology caused by capitalism. It's interesting that for some leftists, they claim the same just in the opposite way. Binary sex, men, women, heterosexuality is the product of bourgeois order. In itself, sexist, polymorphously perverse, whatever. I think they're both wrong. I think sexuality is in itself a big mess. And this is what Freud demonstrated. And this is especially important today when the existing consumerist and so on system plays these libidinal games, not simply promising you sexual favors or whatever, but allowing you to discover perverted pleasure in suffering itself. I not only mean extreme cases like what I began with, those testicle pressures or whatever. I mean, like I was always fascinated. Check it on, you find it easily on YouTube. Joseph Goebbels made in the early 43, after the Stalingrad defeat, a big speech where he doesn't simply pacify the people. Don't worry, we will win the war, everything. No, he says, he promises people a total war. He says, you will have to work, you will suffer. You cannot even imagine how much you will suffer. And people enjoy this. They applaud like crazy and so on and so on. You know, we must admit that our psychic life is irrational, is not maybe the right way, but it's inconsistent, confused, which is why this doesn't mean, oh, there is some deeper irrational nature. No, no, no. We have to be rationalist to the end, but rationalist in this deeper level of rationally explaining what appears as irrationalities.
Right. Thank you very much for that. And just a quick reminder, we do have about 41 questions right now in line, and 14 people right now waiting to raise the question by themselves. So we have quite a few questions right now in line, which of course we're not going to answer all of them.
Okay, we will not be able to, but I promise that I will try not to behave like Fidel Castro in a benevolent way of talking too much. No, I will try. I will not be exactly like Zen Buddhist, you know. Famous Zen Buddhists, you ask them a difficult question, then they just give you a paradox, like clap with one hand or listen to your silence. No, I will not do that, but also not too long. I will try to be as short as possible, and let's see. Let's go on.
Okay.
How it goes.
Right. Now, Donglai.
Hi, can you hear me?
I hope I hear you. I see a guy who is sleeping.
Oh, really? Can you hear me?
Photo.
I'm speaking up a little bit. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Thank you so much, Professor Zizek. I was really intrigued by your proposal of the idea of neo-federalism versus anti-fragility. And these concepts can be very useful in our interpretation of how we deal with or have dealt with the pandemic. So I was just curious how you may interpret China's shifts of the lockdown policies or COVID-19 control policies in recent years in relation to these two concepts, because for me, it sounds like at first it was a great demonstration of anti-fragility, but it soon turned into something like stubborn tenacity, something that got sticky, that got maybe too anti-fragile at the moment. So, and then suddenly we had this release from the COVID control policy. So all these shifts seem to be really sudden. I just wonder how you interpret China's different approach at the beginning and then the sudden end of the lockdown, and how do you interpret this? Yeah, in relation to those concepts.
There are many things that I don't know, so I cannot pass a judgment. Or were you in the first 2 years too tough? Was it too much? We on the West, we like to show all those videos or how people were literally chained to their homes and so on. But I will give you a very abstract answer because my country was almost the opposite of China in the sense that they changed the rules all the time, every week, sometimes twice a week, and it caused total confusion. For example, on Saturday, they said all schools will be closed on Monday. Then Sunday evening, they said, no, just elementary schools till the 4th grade. Then it was total confusion. So I think that the basic approach, which was a kind of okay, I don't agree with, from what I know, with the way it was done, with all the brutality and so on. But I think that a certain stability, that you can count on the same rules and so on, works much better than too many quick changes. I think that it's very important that you don't lose, that ordinary people don't lose the trust in the state, in the authorities. This is very bad. Now I will say something slightly cynical. Even if people those in the government, in reality, they are not sure. It's good for the social psychology that you act as if you are sure. You know what I mean? There must be this how should I put it, basic trust. I don't know enough about COVID and so on, but the mistake in Europe was that the question of COVID was politicized. With all these debates, it's a conspiracy theory, COVID doesn't even exist, on the other hand, and so on. And so that it was politicized, but not in a good way. What I would have tried to do is to keep it depoliticized and, for example, do the vaccination and all the measures as simple depoliticized medical measures and so on. What again surprised me is how in Europe it's very interesting how confused politically and mixed were the anti-vaxxers, those who didn't want to. We have the right-wing anti-vaxxers who claimed this is a plan for Bill Gates with American government. They apparently just vaccinate you. In reality, they put some chips into you. It's a first step towards total totalitarian control and so on. It was the right-wing dream. On the other hand, there were many leftists who claimed this helps big medical companies, vaccination was not needed, and so on. and so on. I am not qualified to judge, although I tend to take COVID seriously for a simple reason that in Slovenia it was pretty rough, and when it began in New York, the one who maybe some of you have heard, Michael Sorkin, an architect who was also building some things in China, husband of John Cobjet, he died, not in China, in New York at the beginning. It was chaotic situation and so on. So for me, you know, which is for me almost, now I come to a different topic. What fascinated me, fascinated in a horrible sense, apropos COVID, maybe in China it was different, but in the West, what I would have called the big other, the social order, not just institutional order, but the public space is disintegrating, which is why I think that in critical situations like COVID, it's very important to have organized forms of public mourning. It can be religious, it can be social, thus, so that you are not alone with your pain. You can, in an organized way, share your pain in solidarity with others. This in Europe completely failed. All that remained was privatized pain shared on Facebook, and it was not a real community. It was just the exchange of private hysterical explosions and so on. You know, the big art of collective mourning rituals is that out of a tragedy, they made some group mass experience of solidarity which brings inner peace. I don't know, again, how it is with you, but in United States and in Europe, this completely failed. You know, because I think that to really mourn properly, you have to do this in a minimal forum of a collective.
Right. Thank you very much for that. And we can now move to the next participant, Yating.
You are in a Stalinist role now. You have to make the choice. Sorry, please do it.
Yeah.
I have names there. Who is Yating Zhao?
Yating, yeah. Yating, can you hear us? Yeah, but we cannot hear from. Yeah, I think she's connecting
to audio.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes, we can hear you now, Yating. Go ahead.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. Sorry, I am not very good at technical problem. So thank you so much, Professor Zizek, especially on the very interesting points on the importance of change on ideological factors nowadays and this anti-fragility concept. So my question is also kind of referring to this concept. Towards the end of your speech, you were referring to the stability of Chinese system and institutions. So I'm not sure what's your opinions on the changes brought in by the current Chinese President Xi to this profit-driven or somehow capitalist governance system under Deng Xiaoping and his followers. So from China's side, we always see there will be change and people are not that confident anymore on the stability of Chinese system. And also, I want to know your insights on the impact of this change from China towards the world. So I think it will also have some implications on global governance in the future. Yeah, that's my question. Thank you.
Very interesting question. Unfortunately, not because of any type of opportunism. But simply, I sincerely don't know enough. I basically tend to disagree with both extreme opinions. One is the opinion of some ex-hardline Maoists, and not only them in the West, who claim Deng Xiaoping simply triggered a capitalist counter-revolution. And it was, you are no longer in any serious sense a socialist country. And okay, they of course find many arguments, like they claim that a typical West European successful country, like Scandinavian countries, the level of equality is there much higher than in China. The so-called social democratic measures, free education, healthcare, blah, blah, care for old people, are much more organized than in China. So what I find, I don't agree with it. It's too simple. But do you know, is this debated in China or it's too touchy? There is in the West now a whole sub-trend which claims that Deng Xiaoping, what he basically did is organized a passage from communism to fascism. They don't mean fascism in this primitive sense, you know, brutal violence, blah, blah, but in the sense that you have a relatively free market economy, but nonetheless under the control of the state, which, in order to prevent the liberal capitalist chaos, usually mobilizes some old traditions. And I don't agree with this analysis, although I'm here very evil. Do you know that I read some studies sympathetic to the great founding father of modern China, Sun Yat-sen, who showed at some point clear sympathies for fascism, you know, just before he died? His idea was this one. Yes, in Asia, because of the brutal imperialist intervention, opium war, and so on, we are caught in what the West misperceives as some Asian apathy, inactivity. So we need a more active subjectivity, but we need a collective type of subjectivity, not Western individual subjectivity. And then he said what Mussolini did in Italy would perhaps be the model for us. Also connected with this is this attempt to combine relative capitalist freedom with return to Confucian. Do I pronounce it correctly? Will you understand me? Confucius, how do you pronounce this?
Confucian, yeah.
Yeah, whatever, not confusion.
Yeah, confusion.
Yeah, you know what that. Yeah. So this is, in some formal sense, a typical fascist procedure, as somebody called it, back to the future. The idea that the only way to progress to the future, maybe even in a faster way, is to rely on some great elements of past tradition, which allows you to avoid self-destructive capitalist chaos. In some abstract sense, I have nothing against this. I just am afraid to, as I already said at the beginning, to read China simply along the terms of this opposition, you know, either Western liberalism, good thing, or return to aggressive Maoism or cultural revolution. So this may surprise you. I don't yet have a good theory, but I do read not so much the speeches of, how do you pronounce it, Xi, your new leader, but also the person who I think is really interesting. Maybe he provides the key, Wang Huning, the big ideologist. He is now, I think, if we are to trust this hierarchy, is more or less the third person. What he wrote, I read his book, America Against America. It's very interesting. It's precisely this problem. He admires America, dynamism, blah, blah, but he sees signs of social decay there. So I'm well aware of new moments of oppression and so on now, but even in, don't misunderstand me, I am basically critical towards what's going on now in China. But I am not ready to dismiss Xi totally. He said something already a year ago, which sounded to me profound. He said that maybe to reduce the poverty of the poor, we should sacrifice a little bit of the growth. You know, I see what he is doing now, not as a simple return to wild Maoism. Okay, there is a question of external politics, mainland versus Taiwan. I don't know enough about that. I mean, to pass a qualified judgment. But he, I think, correctly perceived this explosion of new multi-billionaire, almost feudal oligarchs in China as a danger. So the way I read it, his measures are not simply anti-capitalist. It's even up to a point to promote low-level capitalism, inventive small companies, and so on, against monopolistic domination. But maybe I am wrong. I simply, sorry, just another point. Where I do disagree, so that you will not accuse me of idealizing the image, is I think this will not end well. This game that you, China, are playing now with Russia, this deeper solidarity and so on, you know, because Russia stands for this full sovereignty of individual states and so on. The great enemy of Russia, this is clear today, is European Union. They want European Union to, so if you ask me what the ideal thing would have been at this moment, it would have been some kind of a historic pact between European Union and China. Because there are good reasons for it. European Union sees more and more that, especially if Trump will return in the United States, that it will not be it will be a catastrophe for Europe. Now, with Russia, it's quite possible that Trump will make a kind of a separate pact with Russia and so on. So I think the true choice for me is, you know, China had all that project of a new Silk Road or whatever, all that stuff. That's good, much more clearly than Russia. China is fully aware that we need in a global world and that forms of global cooperation will be more needed than ever. Imagine just, let me tell you a story about the guy with whom I began, that French catastrophe theorist, Jean-Pierre Dupuy. He told me that 3 days after Fukushima explosion, north of Tokyo in Japan, he visited as part of a special delegation Tokyo. And he told me something very interesting, that when it wasn't clear how strong the radiation will be, for one day, Japanese government was in a total panic because they thought they will have to evacuate the entire Tokyo area, which means more than 30 million people. How to do it? It's difficult to move them to other part of the Japan. If we would have a more obligatory regulated international space, the solution is obvious. Russia, not that Japan should colonize Russia. It remains Russia, but since because of the global warming in eastern, northern Siberia, there is now a lot of fertile land and so on. But there will be even more problems like this. Parts of the world are becoming uninhabitable. So no, I'm not advocating a global world power like world government. That would be corruption that we cannot even imagine. But some more obligatory forms of international cooperation. And also, I don't like this Putin's cards on, when he mentions Islamic states, Arab Emirates, and so on. Okay, but again, that's why I mentioned Iran. Who in Iran should we be solidary with? Should we simply stick to the existing regime, which is now under threat from an incredibly authentic popular movement, and so on? So I think that almost, I would say, in a good old Maoist way, but nonetheless redefined in today's terms, when we know more about racism, sexual oppression, and so on, the value of global solidarity of the oppressed should be emphasized more than ever. So the big choice of China now is to put all their bets on Russia. Maybe they're doing for some strategic reasons to guarantee raw materials there or whatever. But I think if China becomes one bloc with Russia, it's dead. I think China should absolutely remain open to Western Europe, because Western Europe is now in a deep crisis. Western Europe was living comfortably under the American nuclear umbrella. Now this time is over. Western Europe needs a big ally bloc. Unfortunately, with this madness now, this cannot be Russia. And also, for obvious egotist reasons, we like China because, it's far away. It doesn't threaten us directly. That would be, if you ask me, my dream. My dream. To say anything, again, I am very critical from what I know up to a point towards what is happening in China, but I am not ready to dismiss what is going on now as a simple pro-Maoist hardline coup. No, you are already so deep in market economy and so on, and those in power know it, that there can be further limitations to freedom, whatever, up and down, but I don't think you can simply return to a full, whatever fashionable term I should use, totalitarian country.
Right.
Thank you.
Thank you, Yajing.
Let's do one more so that.
Yeah. I'm just paraphrasing several people's questions altogether because I think they're related. And
You
Professor,
should, sorry, I always tell this story. Once I was years ago in Shanghai, and I gave a talk. And there was a kind, nice old lady who was translating me. It was consecutive translation. And at the end, somebody asked me a difficult question. And I didn't have a good answer. So I was just jumping around, bluffing for 5-10 minutes. And then the lady translated it into Chinese with one sentence. And I was a little bit intrigued. And I asked her, sorry, but how did you translate all that stuff? And you know what she told me? I loved her. Afterwards, we embraced, we became friends. She said, I just told them the truth. Professor Zizek doesn't have a good answer, so he is a little bit bluffing around, you know. This is the best translation that I have. So please, let's proceed in this way. Oh, yeah.
Okay. And because there's several people's questions, they're in a way interconnected. So I'm like putting them together basically. So I think the question is basically saying that what you're trying to promote, this kind of world communism, seem to be other form of universalism or internationalism.
Yeah.
And the question is always that what will be the basis of such internationalism, and especially on the very question of what kind of state or state machine you have in your mind behind this kind of form of new internationalism. And in that imagination of a new state or new state machine, what are the roles of the precarious workers, for example? How do you mobilize them? What kind of role do they actually play? Because they're actually different from the traditional working class. Or they stay in the factory, they have their union.
I will again, if there are some progressive left in the wrong way, members in the public, I will disappoint them. Some of my friends elevate not so much precarious workers as immigrant workers as the new authentic working class. They think that at least in the developed countries, the working class is totally incorporated into a system, and they think that this, they call them nomadic proletarians, no home and so on, that they are the future. I don't think so. I think that it's a much, at least in Europe, it's a much more complex, precarious workers. They are, again, in a very difficult situation. It's up to them because on the one hand, precarious workers are arguably, most of them, the most exploited. Because, you know, if you are precarious, the company or whoever temporarily exploit you, they don't pay your health insurance, retirement, blah, blah, blah. It's very easy for them. But the problem is that nonetheless, you experience, as I said, your situation like that of freedom. You know, I go to work when I want, I'm free, blah, blah, blah. So here, I think that all we can do now is to introduce some order here, which can be done in the sense of guaranteeing that also precarious workers, this state should simply impose this, that you get health insurance, you get retirement, you get free education for your children, all that stuff. That's the minimum that we can do. With immigrant workers, you know, they claim they are poor proletarians. They came without anything into our world. Yeah, but they don't quite come without anything. They come usually with their very conservative, very strong traditional ideology, which is usually, and there is another which is usually very anti-feminist and so on, and they also want to retain their ideological or cultural identity, which is in itself not bad, but I don't agree with those leftists who claim that if immigrant workers don't integrate into our society, that it's because we are not open enough towards them. This is partially true, but up to a strong point, even they don't really want to be integrated. They are more and more forming their own closed society, where more and more, I know the situation in Malmö, the south of Sweden, where there is a big suburb totally dominated by mostly immigrants from Muslim countries, where police is simply afraid to enter. You get these closed enclaves, and they are not interested in integration. They want to retain their way of life. So, but to the basic question. First, people told me, war communism, am I crazy? Am I dreaming? But listen, I am not dreaming of a big political revolution, a new communist party. I'm talking about measures, maybe even neoconservatives will do them. For example, you know that in COVID, there were already elements of this. Even Trump had to do measures which are senseless from the standpoint of market economy. You know, every individual family got $2,000 per family, and so on and so on. By war communism, I mean not just war, but I mean such an extra emergency state can be war, but can be even more. I don't know, a new epidemic, a global ecological catastrophe, and so on, where you have to act quickly and decisively, and this doesn't make me glad, but you cannot afford slow parliamentary debates, new law, and so on, where you will have to act quickly, guaranteeing the safety of hundreds of millions, and so on and so on. That's what I call war communism, not communist party in power. But, for example, you know, let's say, but it's a bad example because I don't mean primarily war. Let's say you have a war. You don't say we need more arms, let's now organize economy, put it on the market. No, you need the arms now, fast. The state has to directly intervene. So I see the problem of course, I'm not an idiot, of forced centralization and at the same time corruption. But it is possible, and we saw this in some European countries, something magic happened. I remember Spain, where the strong state intervention with elements of what I call war communism, which means measures distributing food, healthcare, which they simply printed money, it wasn't covered by properly, they went in, but combined with extraordinary cases of local self-organization. You know that, for example, in parts of Madrid, this was beautiful. There was no conflict at this point between state and local communities. In each couple of blocks, able people organized themselves and made a list like, do you know in that house, is there some old lady or alone who needs help? And they went to check that. This is more the way I imagine. And even in Ukraine, which is probably not popular in China to mention, Ukraine is, for me, I have friends there who died on the Ukrainian side. Ukraine, the good thing about the war is that they are now seriously putting pressure on their oligarchs. People are already asking, my God, what Ukraine are we fighting for? will we have the same brutal corruption as we had before? So people are fighting, beginning to fight, and also the war. You know how the state organization, army, and so on, closely corroborates with incredible invention of local communities. Like many people there had small drones. And they use them to spy on Russian positions, even in some very primitive way, put bombs on to explode there. It's a true, what the leftists dream, popular war, in the sense of extreme importance of local self-organization of the people. Not just arms, but in this chaos, you need local hospital, care for the old, care for the, this is what I have in mind. Don't be afraid. Not, war communism doesn't mean central committee decides everything and so on. No, it simply means, you know, all people ask, will things return to normal? My answer is normal. By normal, I mean pre-COVID. I think it will not. We are now in a whole series of potential catastrophes. And I'm not saying we should now introduce war communism. We should simply begin to think, to make plans, not solitary, international plans of how will we organize ourselves in when such collective emergencies will explode. This is what I mean by war communism. It's clear that you cannot leave it to the market. Market is too slow here. For example, think about a new pandemic, or a new heat wave which ruins agriculture. How will you organize distribution of food and so on? Problems are global. You know which example I like to use here? Remember 2 years ago, was it 2 years, in the summer, northwest of United States, Seattle, and southwest of Canada, Vancouver, had a heat wave where there in Canada, the temperature reached 50 degrees Celsius. Now, you cannot blame them. They even have a relatively good ecological standards. It's clear that something is wrong in the circulation of air in the north of the northern hemisphere, because we get the same news from northern Russia, some cities on that Arctic Ocean or whatever, where, okay, in the summer, sometimes they get temperature till 15 degrees. One of those cities, which had till now the official title of the coldest city or settlement in the world, got last summer 33 degrees Celsius. So, you know what's the true horror? Some ecological friend of mine told me how, even with things that we accept as a catastrophe, we are still not pessimist enough. In what sense? When we speak about global warming, we think, okay, temperatures will rise to 2-3 degrees. Okay, we lose some cities, coasts, and then there will be a new stability. But there are serious ecological models which prove that what if there will not be simply a new stability, a little bit worse, but still a new stability? What if the whole system will become much more unstable? We are already feeling this in Europe. For example, all of a sudden, for centuries, we weren't used to, you get now every summer 1 or 2 tornadoes in the middle of Europe, in Czech Republic, in Germany, and so on. By war communism, I only think that the solution is not, yes, we should use markets, competition to prevent corruption and so on. But the organization would have to be, I wouldn't even say socialized, but yes, not nationalized, but more socialized. Capitalism, free market is useful, but it will have to be more under some form of social control. I don't see any way out. Imagine again that something like Fukushima happens, like that, you know, that nuclear plant on the border, border, where it's occupied by Russians, but it's also in Ukraine, nuclear plant, the biggest in Europe. What if that one explodes? It means also for Russia a terrifying catastrophe. Tens of millions of people to be moved. How to do this? Why? We need to stop this belief like, oh, it's trauma, but patience, in 2-3 years, things will return to normal. I'm more of a pessimist here. Things will not return to normal.
Yeah.
Sorry, I'm now a little bit getting tired. Let's finish with one more for symbolic.
Yeah, so do you still want to take one more? We can take one.
Yes,
like
let's do one more, to be fair.
Let's do one more. Okay. I will because Zeyu, I think that who promote a lot of questions there already, who put a lot of questions there already. So I will get him or her.
Sorry, I thought for you in China it's clear from names.
Not actually, no. Yeah.
We have a couple of names like Robin in my country and in English. Robin can be masculine or feminine, no? You don't know, but these are exceptions for us.
Yeah.
Hello.
Yes.
I want to ask a question that today we are facing a lot of disasters, and our workers is facing very bad situations. But give a picture of the life of the construction worker or an assembly line worker who have neither the time to study theory or they do not have enough energy to think the struggles. If in this case, how can there be an action? How can there be strikes like a movement?
It's a very good story, please.
Go ahead. Just want to check whether you kind of grasp the question.
It's a very good point because I don't think it's only construction workers. I don't know how it is in China, but we can even speak here about, although it's not formally slavery, it's de facto slavery with construction workers and also with people whom they import, allowed to enter temporarily without families, when there is the harvest to pick up the fruits and so on. One big slavery center is just north of on Mediterranean coast, the south of Spain. They have their gigantic artificially irrigated fields. Large percentage of European fruits and especially vegetables come from there. When there is a harvest season, like 100, 200,000 people come from Morocco, Algeria, from those countries, and it's de facto slavery. Like they work for minimal money, they're totally exploited. There are no towns near, they have no amusement. And it's the same in Arab Emirates. Once I visited, private visit, Dubai, and I become friendly with a Pakistani taxi driver, okay, friendly. We started to talk and he took me and my son to a kind of a quick Marxist tour there. And he showed me these construction sites and I noticed things. He said, do you see how they put these scaffolds, what you put around the building to finish it? They were without any protection. He told me people are just falling down and so on there, and they replace them with others. They don't care, and they cannot even return home. They take their passports, and they are extremely exploited. If they can send home, they usually come from, I don't know, Indonesia, Nepal, parts of India, and so on. If they can send home like $150 per month, it's already considered good for them. So we have today, it's not called slavery, but it's de facto slavery. They're not even allowed to enter the downtown of the city with all the noble shopping malls. They have to remain in there. They call them industrial cities. It's really barracks for the poor. And it's so easy to get them that if you want to strike, they say, first, okay, perfect, go back, who cares? You are immediately put on a plane home and so on, you know. So what I'm saying is that that's why I don't believe that these poorest workers themselves will organize themselves. They will need help, maybe from precarious workers, they will, and so on. They are in such a desperate situation. They are not Marxian proletariat because in some sense they are worse than Marxian proletariat. So I'm here. This is for me one more argument that don't fetishize the poor. The poor are today, those at the bottom, are today in such a tragic situation that they are even losing the will to change. A friend of mine went as a tourist, but it wasn't tourism, just to see, you know, in West Central Africa, Burkina Faso, Mali, those abandoned countries. And he told me, people are so desperate there, they don't even dream about maybe there will be a better future. Their whole perspective is how to survive. Will we be alive in a couple of months and so on? They simply stopped thinking in the long term. This is the problem today. I don't have this old Marxist hope that they will gain class consciousness, they will organize themselves, and so on and so on. No, we need a more global coalition of young, precarious intellectuals, and so on and so on.
Right.
That's okay, so don't kill me if I abandon you now. I'm half dead now, you know. But I was really grateful for this experience. If you want, we can just give me a couple of months that I survive. we can, with pleasure, do it again. And I'm surprised. Did you study where? Made a doctor's thesis in Harvard, or how is your English so good?
Do you mean
you as a person? How is your English so good?
Because I was studying in Europe, mainly in the UK, for many years, for about 9 years in total, from undergrad all the way to my PhD.
Yeah, because like you know who are the worst for me in Europe? French people. They
French
don't.
People.
Many of them even don't want to learn English.
That's true. Yes.
And they are proud not to learn English. You know. They still think that the French language is what was still 30 years ago, you know, the central level of diplomacy and so on and so on. They are already dead out, but they don't know that. One has, you know, the example that I always use, like in cartoons, a cat walks, then there is no ground. She walks in thin air, and then only when she looks down, it falls down. No, they remind me of this cat. They are up because they didn't yet look down and see that they are
already. Exactly. Yeah.
So listen, thanks very much. It was a pleasure.
And it's definitely a pleasure to have you as well, and I believe that all of audience will feel the same.
Don't talk now like a Maoist, all the people you know. But you know who gave the best answer, totalitarian, to this? In the first year or second of Iranian revolution, the old one, Khomeini said, we are most human revolution. We didn't kill even one person. Then some journalists asked him, but wait a minute, I read in the newspapers, traitors were shot here, there. And he said, these are not real people, these are dogs. And so on. You know, so I hope you meant this. All are satisfied because those who are not satisfied are not one of us. We will
are not there anymore.
They're not anymore. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much. Yes.
Bye.
Yeah, and have a good day. Bye. Right. Thank you everyone for attending, and it's a pleasant night, and thank you for being there. And we thank again for the volunteers from Peace Lab, and also that for the Program Institute who support